Pilot orders black girl to switch seat. Moments later, her mom, the airline owner, arrives. And what happened next in Seat 3A of Vista Airways Flight 447 would expose the kind of racial discrimination that doesn't hide behind policy but wears a wedding ring and uses a husband's authority to humiliate a child 30,000 feet above the ground where nobody can escape and everyone chooses to watch instead of intervene. You need to move to the back where you belong. This seat isn't for people like you. The words slammed into 13-year-old Zara Mitchell like turbulence that knocks the breath from your lungs, her fingers gripping the armrest of Seat 3A hard enough to leave marks while a white woman in her 50s stood in the aisle with arms crossed and eyes cold with the kind of entitlement that comes from never being told no, never being questioned, never facing consequences for cruelty wrapped in commands. Zara's hands shook as she tried to process what was happening, tried to understand why the stranger was demanding she abandon the first-class seat her ticket clearly assigned her, the seat she'd chosen specifically because the window view helped calm her nerves about flying alone to the National Youth Tech Summit in Seattle where she'd be presenting the AI algorithm she'd spent 2 years developing. Vista Airways Flight 447 sat on the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare, engines humming that pre-takeoff sound that means you're trapped now, committed to this metal tube with these people and whatever happens next. And Zara looked around first class at businessmen in suits and women with designer bags who were suddenly very interested in their phones and magazines, their cameras out recording everything but their mouths staying firmly closed because that's what bystanders do in America when racism unfolds 3 feet away. They document it for likes and shares, but they don't stop it in the moment when stopping it might actually cost them something. "This is my seat," Zara said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears building behind her eyes, holding up her boarding pass like evidence in a trial where she was somehow defendant instead of victim. "I have first class. Seat 3, my ticket says so," and the white woman whose name was Catherine Reeves, though Zara didn't know that yet, laughed that particular laugh that sounds like breaking glass, sharp and meant to cut. Here's what nobody tells you about racism in 2026. It didn't die with the civil rights movement or fade with hashtags and awareness campaigns. It evolved and got bolder and more vicious because now it knows how to use systems and authority and husbands' uniforms to enforce the same hatred our grandparents fought. And somehow that makes it worse because at least segregation was honest about what it was. Now it hides behind words like appropriate seating and passenger comfort and following. Procedures that don't exist anywhere except in the minds of people who believe black children don't belong in first class. If you can watch a 13-year-old girl being told she belongs in the back of the plane and not immediately hit that subscribe button, you're part of the problem we're trying to solve. If you think this kind of airline discrimination is rare or exaggerated, drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from and what time it is, because we're building a community that refuses to stay silent while children get humiliated at cruising altitude. And if you've ever been profiled or dismissed or treated like your presence required justification, smash that like button and tell us your story, because Zara needs to know she's not alone, and this channel exists to expose exactly these moments that airlines pray never go viral. Zara had felt this shock before, this disbelief mixed with recognition, like when her robotics team captain assumed she was there to take notes, not lead the engineering, like when store security followed her through aisles while white kids shoplifted unbothered. So the surprise wasn't that this woman saw a black girl in first class and decided something was wrong. The surprise was that it was happening here, now, on a plane about to take off where escape was impossible and witnesses were everywhere but help was nowhere. Catherine turned toward the cockpit and raised her voice loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "Someone get the captain. We have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions." And Zara's stomach dropped because she understood with terrible clarity that this woman wasn't just a racist passenger. She had the kind of access that meant whatever happened next would be official and sanctioned and wrapped in the authority of the very pilot who was supposed to keep everyone safe. The cockpit door opened and a man in a captain's uniform emerged, and Catherine smiled at him with the intimacy of shared secrets and decades together. And Zara realized too late that the woman trying to remove her from first class was married to the man who controlled whether this plane took off at all. But to understand how Zara Mitchell ended up facing down a pilot's wife at 30,000 feet, we need to go back 8 hours to a brownstone in Chicago's South Side where a 13-year-old tech prodigy was packing her laptop and trying not to think about how terrified she was of flying alone for the first time in her life. Zara Mitchell was 13 years and 7 months old. an 8th grader at Lincoln Park STEM Academy where she'd skipped 2 grades because her mind worked faster than curriculum could contain it, and she'd spent the last 2 years building an artificial intelligence algorithm that could predict climate change patterns with 87% accuracy, which was why the National Youth Tech Summit had invited her to Seattle to present her research alongside college students and professional scientists who were twice her age and half as innovative. She lived with her mother Diane Mitchell in a modest home that didn't advertise the fact that Diane owned Vista Airways, a regional airline she'd built from 3 planes and a dream into a 50-aircraft operation serving the Midwest, because both mother and daughter understood that wealth made you a target and black wealth made you a spectacle, so they lived quietly and dressed normally and let people make their assumptions. Zara was the kid who tutored classmates in calculus during lunch, who volunteered at the community center teaching coding to elementary students, who'd won the Chicago Science Fair 3 years running and donated her prize money to schools that couldn't afford computer labs. And her personality was that particular combination of brilliant and humble that made adults say she's going places while other kids said she's actually cool for a genius. She carried a worn backpack covered in NASA patches and equality pins, and inside that backpack was her laptop with 2 years of climate research, her presentation notes that she'd rewritten 17 times, and a photo of her grandmother who'd marched with Dr. King in Selma and told Zara stories about restaurants that wouldn't serve her and schools that wouldn't teach her and a country that tried to break her spirit but never succeeded. This trip to Seattle represented everything Zara had worked toward: validation that her research mattered, proof that a black girl from the South Side could compete with anyone, and her mother had insisted she fly first class on Vista Airways not because they needed to show off but because Diane wanted her daughter's first solo flight to be comfortable and special and worthy of the moment. Wanted Zara to understand that she belonged in spaces where excellence was celebrated regardless of who expected her there. That morning Zara had packed carefully, choosing her favorite hoodie with the code written across the front, jeans her mother said were too ripped but Zara insisted were fashionable, and sneakers that cost less than what some kids spent on lunch because Zara believed money should build things, not just buy things. Her mother had driven her to O'Hare at 5 in the morning, both of them quiet with the weight of this milestone, this first time Zara would board a plane without her mother beside her, and Diane had held her daughter's face in both hands at the departure curb and said, "Remember who you are, remember what you're worth, and if anyone tries to make you feel small you call me immediately." Check-in at Vista Airways had been smooth, the gate agent smiling when she saw Zara's first-class ticket and saying someone special. Security had waved her through with barely a glance because 13-year-olds with laptops and big dreams aren't typically considered threats, and the gate waiting area had been filled with business travelers on phones and families wrangling children and college students sleeping on their backpacks. Zara had sat near the window watching planes take off and land, her stomach doing flips that had nothing to do with turbulence and everything to do with the fact that she was doing this alone, proving to herself and her mother and maybe the whole world that she was ready for whatever came next. Boarding Group 1 was called and Zara had walked down the jetway with her backpack heavy on one shoulder and her boarding pass clutched in sweaty hands. And when she stepped onto Vista Airways Flight 447, the flight attendants had been lovely, a young woman named Monica saying "Welcome aboard, sweetie," and helping her find the overhead bin, another attendant bringing her a bottle of water and a pack of cookies without being asked. Seat 3A was a window seat in the 3rd row of first class. The leather soft and clean, the legroom generous, the little TV screen in the seat back loaded with movies Zara actually wanted to watch, and for the first 20 minutes of boarding she'd felt like maybe this wouldn't be so scary after all. Other passengers filtered past her, a businessman in 2A who didn't look up from his tablet, a young couple in row 4 holding hands and whispering, an older woman in 5C reading a paperback thriller, and everyone seemed normal and fine and completely uninterested in the black teenager in the hoodie until Catherine Reeves boarded through the main cabin door and stopped dead when she saw Zara sitting in first class like she belonged there. Catherine's first look had been surprise, then confusion, then something harder that Zara recognized from department stores and restaurant hostess stands, that expression that said "you don't fit here," and when Catherine walked past Zara's row her eyes had lingered too long on Zara's face, her clothes, her backpack with its equality pins, and Zara had felt her stomach tighten because she knew that look, had seen it enough times to understand it meant trouble even before Catherine opened her. The first microaggression came disguised as concern. Catherine leaning over Zara's seat and asking, "Honey, are you sure you're in the right section? First class is pretty expensive." And Zara had held up her boarding pass and said, "Yes, ma'am, this is my seat." But Catherine had squinted at the pass like she was looking for forgery, like a black girl in first class required additional verification that white passengers never needed to provide. Catherine had walked away muttering something Zara couldn't quite hear but could definitely interpret from tone alone. And 5 minutes later she'd returned with that command that would change everything: "You need to move to the back where you belong." And now the cockpit door was opening and a pilot was emerging, and Zara realized with horror that the woman trying to remove her from first class had the kind of access that meant this discrimination came with authority. Captain Richard Reeves stepped out of the cockpit with the confident stride of a man who'd flown for Vista Airways for 19 years and never once questioned whether his authority might be wrong. And the moment Zara saw Catherine's face light up with that particular smile wives give husbands when they need backup for cruelty, she understood that this situation had just escalated from uncomfortable to dangerous in the span of a heartbeat. "Richard, honey, we have a situation," Catherine said loud enough for first class to hear, her voice dripping with manufactured concern that sounded like customer service but felt like a threat. "This young lady is refusing to move from a seat that clearly isn't appropriate for her. I've asked her nicely multiple times, but she's being difficult, and I think we need to handle this before we take off." Zara's hands started shaking harder because the word difficult was code language she recognized from every time a teacher called her argumentative for correcting wrong information or a store manager called her aggressive for asking why security only followed black customers. And now this woman was using that same weapon at 30,000 feet where Zara couldn't walk away or call for help or do anything except sit there and take whatever came next. Captain Reeves looked down at Zara with eyes that had already decided she was guilty of something, his expression carrying that particular mix of annoyance and assumption that said he'd made up his mind before hearing her side. And when he spoke, his voice had that false patience adults use when they're pretending to be reasonable while planning to be anything but. "Miss, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," he said, and Zara held it up with trembling fingers, the paper crinkling from how hard she was gripping it, and Richard took it from her hands like he was collecting evidence instead of verifying what any competent person could see in 2 seconds, that seat 3A was exactly where Zara belonged. He studied the boarding pass for what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, his wife standing beside him with arms crossed and that smug expression people wear when they think they're about to win, and other passengers were openly staring now, phones out recording, some people looking uncomfortable but nobody saying a word because that's what happens when racism performs itself in public spaces. Witnesses multiply but intervention stays at 0. "This says first class, but there must be some mistake," Richard finally said, his voice carrying that tone of absolute certainty that makes lies sound like truth. "First-class tickets are quite expensive, and I'm not sure how a young person traveling alone would have access to that kind of purchase. So we're going to need to verify this with our booking system before we can proceed with departure." The implication hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, the unspoken accusation that Zara had somehow stolen or forged her ticket because in Captain Richard Reeves' worldview black teenagers didn't belong in first class unless they were athletes or celebrities, and Zara was neither. Just a girl in a hoodie with a backpack full of dreams he couldn't begin to comprehend. "My mother bought this ticket," Zara said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be but still there, still fighting. "She wanted me to be comfortable on my first flight alone. I'm going to Seattle for the National Youth Tech Summit to present my research on climate change algorithms. This is my seat and I have every right to be here." Catherine actually laughed at that, a sound like glass breaking that made Zara flinch, and she turned to her husband with theatrical disbelief. "Tech Summit," she says. "Richard, this is getting ridiculous. The child is clearly making up stories to justify sitting where she doesn't belong, and I really think we need to resolve this quickly before we're further delayed. Here's what nobody tells you about racial profiling on airplanes. It doesn't happen in darkness or secrecy. It happens in full view of dozens of witnesses who will film it and share it and express outrage later but won't say a single word while it's actually unfolding." And Zara looked around first class at all those phones pointed at her documenting her humiliation for content but not her humanity for intervention, and she felt something inside her start to crack. Captain Reeves made his decision with the kind of finality that comes from never having his judgment questioned, his voice taking on that official airline tone that makes discrimination sound like policy. Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and move to an available seat in economy. We'll sort out the ticketing issue once we land in Seattle, but right now you're delaying our departure and I need compliance from all passengers. The word compliance felt like a slap, like Zara was cargo instead of a customer, like her 13 years of existence and 2 years of research and lifetime of proving herself worthy meant nothing compared to a pilot's wife who'd decided black girls don't belong in first class. And Zara felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall because crying would give these people exactly what they wanted, proof that she was just a child who couldn't handle adult spaces. I'm not moving, Zara said, her voice shaking but her spine straight, channeling her grandmother who'd faced fire hoses and police dogs and still marched forward. This is my assigned seat, my ticket is legitimate, my mother paid for first class and I belong here. You can't make me move just because your wife doesn't think I look right. The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder, everyone in first class holding their breath waiting to see if this pilot would back down or double down, and Catherine's face went red with rage that someone had dared to name what was happening out loud, that a child had called their racism exactly what it was instead of pretending it was about procedures or policies or anything except the color of Zara's skin. Richard's jaw clenched and his hand moved toward his radio, and Zara knew with sinking certainty that whatever happened next would be forceful and public and captured on a dozen phones that would share her trauma for clicks but wouldn't stop it from happening. And she reached into her pocket for her phone because if these people were going to remove her from her seat, then her mother needed to know that Vista Airways employees were discriminating against passengers, even if those passengers happened to be the owner's daughter. Miss, if you don't move voluntarily, I will have security remove you from this aircraft, Captain Reeves said, his final warning delivered with the coldness of someone who'd made peace with being cruel, and Zara looked into his eyes and saw no mercy there, no recognition of her humanity, just determination to put her back in whatever place he believed black children belonged. And that place was definitely not first class on his airplane. Zara's fingers tightened around her phone as Captain Reeves radioed for ground security, his voice professional and detached like he was reporting a weather delay instead of ordering the removal of a child whose only crime was existing in a space where Catherine Reeves decided she didn't belong. And the 3 minutes it took for security to arrive felt like 3 hours of Zara sitting in her seat trying to stay calm while 60 passengers filmed her humiliation and 0 passengers said this is wrong, stop this, leave that child alone. 2 security officers arrived through the main cabin door, both men looking uncomfortable when they saw the situation involved a teenager in a hoodie clutching a backpack with NASA patches, and the older officer named Marcus checked Zara's boarding pass and looked at Captain Reeves with confusion clear on his face because even airport security could see what the pilot refused to acknowledge, that this girl's ticket was legitimate and this removal was something else entirely. Captain, her documentation is valid, Marcus said carefully, trying to give Richard an exit ramp from the mistake he was accelerating toward. The ticket shows first-class seat 3A purchased and paid in full. There's no irregularity here that would warrant passenger removal, and Officer Marcus emphasized those last words like he was begging this pilot to understand he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Catherine stepped forward before her husband could respond, her voice sharp with the entitlement of someone used to getting her way through proximity to power. Officer, my husband is the captain of this aircraft and he's made a determination that this passenger needs to be reseated. Are you questioning his authority to manage his own plane? Because that seems like something your supervisor should hear about. The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and effective, and Zara watched Marcus's face change from protective to resigned because airline captains have power that security officers don't, and everyone in that cabin understood the hierarchy even if the hierarchy was enforcing racism instead of safety. And when Marcus looked at Zara, his eyes carried an apology his mouth couldn't speak. Miss, I'm going to need you to gather your things and come with me, Marcus said quietly, and Zara felt something break inside her chest, that last piece of hope that adults would do the right thing, that systems would protect her, that being smart and polite and respectful would matter more than the color of her skin. Where are you taking me? Zara asked, her voice cracking on the last word because she already knew the answer but needed to hear them say it out loud. Needed the dozen recording phones to capture exactly what Vista Airways was doing to a 13-year-old girl whose mother owned the very company whose employees were now discriminating against her. We're moving you to an available seat in economy, Captain Reeves said, not even trying to hide behind policy anymore, just stating his decision like it was law because on his aircraft it was. You'll complete your flight to Seattle and we'll address any ticketing concerns upon landing, but right now you're causing a delay and I need you to comply immediately. The word comply kept coming up like Zara was livestock instead of a passenger, like her body was cargo that needed to be moved to the correct section, and she looked around first class one more time at all those witnesses who would post their videos with captions about how terrible this was and how shocked they were, but who right now in this moment when their voices could actually stop this trauma were silent as complicit accomplices. I want to call my mother, Zara said, pulling her phone from her pocket with hands that shook so badly she almost dropped it. I want to talk to my mother before you move me anywhere. And something in her voice must have carried desperation that even Captain Reeves couldn't completely ignore because he nodded once, sharp and impatient. You have 2 minutes, he said, like he was granting a favor instead of basic human dignity. Make your call and then you're moving to economy or you're leaving this aircraft entirely, those are your options. Zara's fingers fumbled with her phone, tears finally spilling down her cheeks because she couldn't hold them back anymore. Because the weight of being 13 and alone and treated like a criminal for sitting in a seat her mother paid for was more than anyone should have to carry, and when she found her mother's contact and hit call her whole body was shaking with sobs she'd been trying to contain for 20 agonizing minutes. The phone rang once, twice, and Zara could feel everyone watching her cry, recording her breakdown, capturing her moment of complete powerlessness for whatever story they'd tell themselves later about why they didn't intervene. And on the third ring her mother answered with the warm voice that meant safety and home and someone who would finally make this stop. Baby, what's wrong? Diane Mitchell said, her CEO voice dropping immediately into mother mode because she could hear her daughter's tears through the phone. Zara, talk to me, what happened? Are you okay? And that's when Zara broke completely, the words tumbling out between sobs about Catherine and the pilot and being forced to move to economy because they didn't think she belonged in first class. About security standing there looking sorry but doing it anyway, about passengers filming but not helping, about how scared she was and how humiliated she felt and how she just wanted to come home because going to Seattle didn't matter anymore if getting there meant being treated like she was less than human. Diane Mitchell's voice changed in that moment, warmth draining out and something colder and infinitely more dangerous taking its place. The voice of a woman who'd built an airline from nothing and would burn it down before she let her employees terrorize her child. Baby, listen to me very carefully. You stay on that phone, you don't hang up, you let me talk to whoever is in charge right now. Zara held out the phone toward Captain Reeves with shaking hands, her face wet with tears and her voice broken when she spoke. My mother wants to talk to you. And Richard took the phone with that same condescending expression he'd worn throughout this entire nightmare, clearly expecting some angry parent he could placate with corporate speak and empty apologies. This is Captain Richard Reeves. How can I help you? He said into the phone, and what he heard next made his face go from confident to confused to pale in the span of 10 seconds. Diane Mitchell identified herself as the owner and CEO of Vista Airways, the woman who signed his paychecks and held his career in her hands, the mother whose daughter he'd just spent 20 minutes terrorizing, and everyone in first class watched Captain Richard Reeves realize in real time that he'd just destroyed his entire life because his wife couldn't stand seeing a black girl in a seat she'd decided was too good for her. If you're watching this and your heart is breaking for Zara, drop a comment right now saying we stand with you. If you've ever been removed from a space you paid for because someone decided you didn't belong, tell us your story because this community refuses to let these moments disappear. Hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve protection from racism, not exposure to it. Smash that like button if you want to see what happens when a CEO mother unleashes consequences on employees who hurt her daughter. Tell us where you're watching from because we need to know how far this story reaches and how many people understand that staying silent while watching discrimination makes you complicit in the harm. This video is about to show you what accountability looks like when the victim has power and the perpetrators have none. Stay with us because Captain Reeves' career ends in the next 60 seconds and Catherine Reeves' humiliation is just beginning. Captain Richard Reeves stood frozen in the aisle of first class holding a phone that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, his face cycling through shades of white to gray to something close to green as Diane Mitchell's voice came through the speaker sharp enough to cut through 19 years of pilot arrogance and make him understand that the child he'd been terrorizing for 20 minutes was the daughter of the woman who could end his career with a single phone call. And judging by the ice In her tone, that call was happening right now in real time while 60 passengers recorded his downfall. "Mrs. Mitchell, I didn't know," Richard stammered, his captain's authority evaporating like water on hot pavement, his hands shaking enough that Zara could see it from her seat where she sat, with tears still streaming down her face and her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "If I had known your daughter was on this flight, I would never have," and Diane cut him off with words that made the entire first-class cabin go silent. "You would never have what Captain Reeves discriminated against her, humiliated her, threatened to have her forcibly removed from a seat I purchased for her? Or are you saying you only treat black children with dignity when you know their mother's own airlines? Because I need you to finish that sentence so I understand exactly what kind of employee has been representing my company for 19 years. The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out because there was no good answer, no explanation that would make this better, no words that could undo what he'd done or unsay what his wife had said or erase the fact that he'd looked at a 13-year-old girl and seen a problem instead of a passenger, and everyone watching understood they were witnessing the moment a career died in real time. Catherine's face had gone from smug to panicked, her hand reaching for her husband's arm like she could somehow pull him back from the edge of the cliff he'd already jumped off, and she leaned toward the phone trying to salvage what couldn't be saved. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Catherine Reeves, Richard's wife. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We were just trying to ensure proper seating arrangements and passenger comfort. Surely you can understand that confusion sometimes happens during boarding." Diane Mitchell's laugh came through the phone speaker, cold and humorless, the sound of someone who'd dealt with racism disguised as policy her entire career and had exactly zero patience for it when directed at her child. "Mrs. Reeves, I heard every word you said to my daughter. She had me on the phone before security even arrived. I heard you tell her she needed to move to the back where she belongs. I heard you call her difficult and accuse her of making up stories about a tech summit that I drove her to the airport to attend this morning. So don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about seating arrangements when we both know it was about the color of her skin." The silence that followed felt like the air before a bomb goes off, everyone in first class holding their breath while Catherine's face crumbled and Richard looked like he might actually pass out. And Zara sat in seat 3A watching these two people who'd made her feel worthless for 20 minutes now scrambling to explain away racism that had been captured on a dozen phones and witnessed by 60 passengers who could testify to exactly what had happened. "Mrs. Mitchell, please," Richard tried again, his voice desperate now, pleading. "I have 19 years with Vista Airways. I have a spotless safety record. I've never had any complaints about discrimination or passenger treatment. This was a misunderstanding that got out of hand, and I deeply apologize to your daughter and to you." But Diane wasn't interested in apologies that came after consequences instead of before cruelty, her voice cutting through his excuses like a scalpel through infected tissue. "You're right, Captain Reeves. You've had 19 years with my airline, which means for 19 years you've been treating passengers with this same bias, and nobody caught you because the victims weren't my daughter. How many other black passengers did you remove from first class? How many families did you humiliate? How many times did my employees watch you discriminate and say nothing because you're a captain and they're just gate agents and flight attendants who need their jobs?" Officer Marcus, who was still standing in the aisle looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifted his weight and cleared his throat, clearly wanting to be anywhere except in the middle of this meltdown, and when Diane heard the sound she addressed him directly through the phone speaker. "Officer, this is Diane Mitchell, CEO of Vista Airways. I'm ordering you to remove Captain Reeves from this aircraft immediately. He's no longer authorized to operate any flight for my airline, and I want him escorted from the plane and the terminal, his access badges revoked, and security notified that he's terminated effective this moment." Richard's face went from pale to red, humiliation and rage mixing into something ugly. "You can't fire me over the phone. There are procedures and union protections and due process. I have rights." Diane's voice came back harder than steel, colder than winter. "You had rights until you decided my daughter didn't. You had union protection until you violated every anti-discrimination policy in our employee handbook. You had due process until you terrorized a child in front of 60 witnesses with phones. Now you have 30 seconds to exit my aircraft before I have security carry you off in handcuffs for trespassing." Catherine started crying then, loud theatrical sobs that sounded more like anger than sadness, her voice shrill when she grabbed for the phone. "This is discrimination against us. You're firing my husband because we're white and you're protecting your daughter because she's black. This is reverse racism and we'll sue. We'll take this to every news outlet and labor board and court until everyone knows what Vista Airways did to us." The laugh that came through the phone speaker made several passengers actually flinch because it carried no humor at all, just the sound of someone who'd heard this argument 1,000 times and had exactly zero tolerance for it. "Mrs. Reeves, you're welcome to try. Please call every news outlet and explain how you boarded a plane, saw a black teenager in first class, decided she didn't belong there, demanded she move to the back, got your pilot husband to threaten her with removal, and are now shocked that consequences followed your actions? I'm sure that story will play beautifully in the court of public opinion, especially when 60 passengers post their videos showing exactly what happened." Officer Marcus moved then, his hand gentle on Richard's shoulder but his voice firm when he spoke. "Captain, I need you to come with me," and Richard Reeves looked around first class one last time at all those recording phones and judging faces, at his wife who was still crying, at Zara who sat in seat 3A with tears drying on her face and something that looked almost like pity in her eyes because even after everything he'd put her through she could still see him as human even when he'd refused to see her that way. "This isn't over," Richard said as Marcus led him toward the exit, his voice carrying that particular bitterness of someone who'd had power and lost it and couldn't quite process what that meant. "I'll fight this termination. I'll make sure everyone knows what really happened here." Diane Mitchell's final words followed him down the aisle, broadcast through Zara's phone for everyone to hear. "Captain Reeves, what really happened is that you racially profiled my daughter and 60 people witnessed it. What really happened is that Vista Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination that you violated spectacularly. What really happened is that you forgot airline captains serve passengers, not the other way around. Now get off my plane." Catherine Reeves stood alone in the aisle after security escorted her husband away, her mascara running in black streams down her cheeks and her hands trembling as she realized that every phone in first class was now pointed directly at her, capturing her tears for an audience that would have zero sympathy for the woman who'd told a child to move to the back where she belongs, and the weight of what she'd done was finally hitting her like turbulence that rattles your bones. "Mrs. Reeves," Diane Mitchell's voice came through Zara's phone speaker again, cold and precise as a surgical blade. "You're also no longer welcome on any Vista Airways flight. I'm adding you to our no-fly list effective immediately for harassment of a minor passenger. You'll receive formal notification within the hour, but consider yourself banned from every aircraft in my fleet." Catherine's face went from red to white in seconds, her voice rising to a pitch that made passengers in economy crane their necks to see what was happening. "You can't do that. I didn't do anything illegal. I was just trying to help my husband maintain order on his aircraft. This is an overreaction and I demand to speak to someone in authority." The irony of demanding to speak to someone in authority when she was literally talking to the CEO and owner of the entire airline would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic, and Diane's response carried the exhaustion of a black woman who'd spent decades explaining racism to white people who insisted on not understanding. "Mrs. Reeves, you told my 13-year-old daughter she needed to move to the back where she belongs. You called her difficult for asserting her right to sit in a seat I purchased. You laughed at her achievements and mocked her intelligence. And you did all of this in front of witnesses who recorded every word. So when you say you didn't do anything illegal, you're technically correct? What you did was morally bankrupt and violation of our passenger conduct policies. Now I'm going to ask Officer Marcus to escort you off this aircraft as well." Catherine looked around first class, desperately searching for allies, for someone to say this was too harsh or unfair or disproportionate, but every face that met her gaze held either disgust or that particular satisfaction people feel when bullies finally face consequences, and the businessman in 2A who'd been silent throughout the entire ordeal finally spoke up with a voice that carried through the cabin. "She should be arrested, not just removed," he said, looking directly at Catherine with contempt that made her shrink back. "What she did to that child was psychological abuse. I recorded the whole thing and I'll be happy to provide it to any authority that wants to press charges for harassment of a minor." Other passengers started voicing agreement, the silence that had protected Catherine and Richard for 20 minutes finally breaking as people found their courage after the danger passed, and a woman from row 5 called out that she had video too, and someone from economy shouted that they'd heard everything and Catherine should be ashamed. And suddenly the mob that had been complicit through their silence was performing outrage for their cameras. rewriting their own cowardice into heroism, after someone with actual power had already done the hard work. Zara watched all of this unfold from seat 3A with her phone still pressed to her ear and her mother's steady breathing on the other end keeping her grounded, and she felt something complicated twist in her chest because yes, these people were right that Catherine deserved consequences, but where were these voices when she'd been sitting here alone and terrified begging for help with her eyes while they filmed her trauma for content instead of intervening to stop it? "Baby, are you okay?" Diane asked softly, her CO voice dropping back into mother mode. "Do you want to come home? I can have another flight arranged in 20 minutes. You don't have to go to Seattle if this is too much." And Zara surprised herself by saying no, by deciding that Catherine and Richard had already stolen 20 minutes of her life and her dignity and she wasn't going to let them take the tech summit too, wasn't going to let racism win by making her too scared or too hurt to present the research she'd spent 2 years developing. "I want to go to Seattle, Mom," Zara said, her voice stronger than it had been since this nightmare started. "I want to present my algorithm and show everyone that I belong in first class and at that summit and anywhere else I choose to be. I'm not letting them make me smaller." Officer Marcus escorted Catherine toward the exit while she protested and cried and threatened lawsuits that everyone knew would go nowhere, and as she passed Zara's row she stopped and looked at the girl she tried to humiliate, and for just a moment something that might have been regret flickered across her face before pride smothered it. "You've ruined our lives," Catherine whispered, venom and grief mixing in her voice. "My husband's career is over, our income is gone, our reputation is destroyed, all because you couldn't just move to a different seat without making it a federal case." The audacity of turning herself into the victim made several passengers gasp, and Zara felt anger rise in her throat hot enough to burn. But before she could respond, Diane's voice came through the phone speaker with words that cut through Catherine's delusion like light through darkness. "Mrs. Reeves, your husband ruined his own career when he chose to discriminate against my daughter. You ruined your reputation when you told a child she belonged in the back. And if your family suffers financial consequences from those choices, then maybe you'll understand a fraction of the suffering you inflicted on a 13-year-old girl who just wanted to fly to a tech summit in peace. Now get off this plane before I have you arrested for trespassing." Catherine left with Officer Marcus's hand on her elbow, her sobs echoing down the jetway while passengers in first class erupted into applause that felt simultaneously validating and hollow because where was this energy 20 minutes ago when Zara actually needed it, when their voices could have stopped the harm instead of just celebrating after someone more powerful had already fixed it. A new captain boarded 10 minutes later, a black woman in her 40s named Captain Jennifer Holmes who walked directly to Zara's row and knelt down so they were eye level, her face carrying the particular understanding that comes from living in skin that makes some people question your qualifications before you even open your mouth. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Captain Holmes and I'll be flying you to Seattle today. I'm so deeply sorry for what you experienced on this aircraft. You deserved better from Vista Airways and from every passenger who witnessed your mistreatment and stayed silent. But I promise you the rest of this flight will be different. You'll be treated with the dignity and respect you should have received from the moment you boarded." Zara nodded because words felt too big for her throat, and Captain Holmes squeezed her shoulder gently before standing and addressing the entire first-class cabin with a voice that made several passengers squirm in their seats. "I want everyone here to understand something. This child showed more courage in the last 30 minutes than most of you have shown in your entire lives. She stood up for herself when every adult around her chose comfort over justice. So if any of you are planning to post your videos online talking about how terrible this was, I want you to ask yourself why you didn't speak up when your voice could have actually helped. Because clicking record is not the same as being brave." The cabin went silent again, but this time the silence felt different, weighted with shame instead of complicity, and Zara felt her mother's breathing on the phone and Captain Holmes's hand on her shoulder and something inside her chest that felt almost like healing even though she knew this trauma would take years to fully process. If this moment made you cry, hit that like button and tell us in the comments whether you would have spoken up or stayed silent. If you've ever been the only person standing up to injustice while others filmed, drop your story below because Zara needs to know she's not alone. Subscribe to this channel if you believe consequences matter and racism shouldn't hide behind authority. Because what happens next will show you the full price Catherine and Richard paid for 20 minutes of cruelty and why some actions echo for the rest of your life. Flight 447 took off 45 minutes late with Captain Jennifer Holmes at the controls and Zara Mitchell still in seat 3A where she'd always belonged, the city of Chicago shrinking beneath them while Zara pressed her forehead against the cold window and tried to process everything that had just happened. Tried to understand how 20 minutes could contain so much cruelty and consequences and change the trajectory of multiple lives, including her own, in ways she wouldn't fully comprehend for. The flight attendant Monica brought Zara hot chocolate without being asked, setting it down on her tray table with a napkin that had sorry written on it in careful handwriting, and when Zara looked up, Monica's eyes were red like she'd been crying in the galley. "I should have said something earlier," Monica whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "I saw what Mrs. Reeves was doing and I knew it was wrong, but she's married to the captain and I was scared of losing my job, and I'm so ashamed that I let fear make me complicit in your suffering." Zara wanted to say it's okay, but the words stuck in her throat because it wasn't okay, none of this was okay, and Monica's apology felt important but insufficient, like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. So instead Zara just nodded and Monica walked away with her shoulders hunched under the weight of her own cowardice finally acknowledged. Meanwhile, 3 rows back, the businessman from 2A was on his laptop typing furiously, and Zara could see his screen reflected in the window showing a post he was composing for LinkedIn about the incident he'd witnessed, about how shocked and appalled he was by the discrimination, about how he'd recorded everything and would be sharing it to raise awareness about ongoing racism in air travel. And Zara felt something bitter rise in her throat because this man who'd sat silent while she cried was now positioning himself as an ally, as a witness to injustice rather than what he actually was, which was another bystander who found his voice only after the victim's mother had already delivered consequences. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother saying the videos were already going viral, that news outlets were requesting interviews, that Vista Airways corporate communications was drafting a statement, and Zara realized with dawning horror that her worst moment was about to become public property. That millions of strangers would watch her cry and debate whether she'd overreacted or if the consequences were too harsh or if this whole thing was real or staged, because that's what happens when trauma goes viral. It stops being yours and becomes content for people to consume and then forget about while you're still living with it every single day. Back in Chicago, Richard Reeves sat in an airport security office having his badges revoked and his access credentials deleted from every system, his hands shaking as he signed termination paperwork that ended 19 years of career in a single afternoon, and the security supervisor processing his exit asked him straight out, "How could you do that to a child? What were you thinking?" And Richard had no answer because the truth was he hadn't been thinking at all, he'd been reacting from assumptions so deep he didn't even recognize them as racism until they cost him everything. Catherine sat in her car in the airport parking garage scrolling through her phone, watching herself go viral in real time, dozens of videos from different angles, all showing her telling Zara to move to the back, all capturing her laugh when Zara mentioned the tech summit, all recording her tears when consequences arrived, and the comments were vicious in ways that made her stomach turn even though part of her understood she deserved every word. Home wreckers said one comment, racist Karen said another, she should be arrested for child abuse said a third, and Catherine realized that her face was now permanently associated with racism, that her name would be Googled and these videos would appear, that job applications and social interactions and every future introduction would be colored by this moment when she'd let her prejudice control her actions and destroyed her family's entire life in the process. Their adult son called Richard's phone 20 minutes after the videos started spreading, his voice tight with anger and disappointment. "Dad, what did you do? My friends are sending me videos of mom telling a kid she belongs in the back of the plane. My coworkers are asking if that's really my parents. How could you both be so stupid and cruel?" And Richard had no defense because there was no defense, just the reality that his son was now associated with his racism and would carry that shame alongside his own. The Reeves family group chat that usually discussed dinner plans and grandkid photos filled with messages from relatives who'd seen the videos, some offering support but most expressing shock and distance, cousins saying they needed space to process this, siblings asking if this was really who Richard and Catherine were, and slowly the family network that had sustained them for decades started fracturing under the weight of actions that couldn't be explained away or forgiven easily. Vista Airways stock actually rose 3 points that afternoon when news broke that the CEO had immediately fired employees for discriminating against a young passenger, investors interpreting the swift action as proof of strong ethical leadership, and financial analysts praised Diane Mitchell's decisive response in op-eds that would run in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, turning Zara's trauma into a case study about corporate responsibility and brand management as if her suffering was primarily valuable for the business lesson it provided. On the plane, Zara opened her laptop and looked at the presentation she'd spent 2 years preparing, the climate change algorithm that could predict weather patterns with 87% accuracy, the research that had earned her an invitation to present alongside scientists 3 times her age, and she wondered if anyone at the summit would see her work or just see the viral video girl, if her achievement would be overshadowed by her trauma, if she'd forever be known as the kid who got it pilot fired instead of the young scientist who might actually help save the planet. Captain Holmes's voice came through the PA system announcing their descent into Seattle, and Zara looked out the window at the city emerging through clouds, at the Space Needle pointing toward sky, at the convention center where tomorrow she'd stand on a stage and present her research, and she made a decision in that moment that this incident wouldn't define her even though she knew it would always be part of her story, that she'd use what happened to fuel her work instead of letting it diminish her dreams. The plane touched down smooth and gentle, Captain Holmes's skill evident in the landing that barely jostled passengers, and when they reached the gate, Zara gathered her backpack with the NASA patches and her laptop with 2 years of research and stood up from seat 3A that had cost her so much to keep, and every passenger in first class watched her walk down the aisle with her head high and her shoulders straight despite everything she'd endured, and some of them clapped and some of them looked away ashamed, and all of them knew they'd witnessed something that would stay with them longer than they wanted it to. Monica met Zara at the door with tears streaming down her face and a hug that Zara didn't quite return but didn't pull away from either, and Monica whispered, "I'm quitting Vista Airways because I can't work for a company where I was too scared to protect a child." And Zara wanted to tell her that wasn't necessary but also understood that sometimes consequences have to extend beyond the obvious perpetrators to include everyone who enabled the harm through their silence. Zara walked through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with her mother's assistant Marcus waiting at arrivals holding a sign with her name, and the moment she saw him she broke down completely. All the strength she'd been performing for the last 3 hours dissolving into sobs that made Marcus drop the sign and pull her into a hug while travelers streamed past them staring and some recognizing her from videos that had already been viewed 40 million times across social media platforms that turned human suffering into algorithmic content. "Your mom wanted to fly out here herself, but she's dealing with the media storm and the board of directors," Marcus explained as he loaded Zara's backpack into the car, his voice gentle because he'd worked for Diane Mitchell long enough to understand that the boss's daughter was more than just the CEO's kid. She was a 13-year-old who'd just survived something that would leave scars nobody could see. "She'll be here tomorrow morning before your presentation. She wouldn't miss it for anything." And Zara nodded but couldn't speak because her throat was too tight with emotions she didn't have names for yet. The hotel suite overlooked Puget Sound, expensive and beautiful in ways that felt wrong given what the day had cost. And Zara sat on the bed scrolling through her phone watching herself go viral in real time, watching strangers dissect her trauma like it was a debate topic instead of the worst experience of her life. And the comments section was a war zone of people arguing whether the consequences were appropriate or if Diane had overreacted or if this whole thing was staged for publicity. Which hurt almost as much as the original discrimination because it meant people thought her tears were performance instead of pain. One video had been edited with dramatic music and text overlays calling it racist pilot destroyed by billionaire mom, turning her suffering into entertainment that had 18 million views and thousands of comments saying things like she deserved it and this is what justice looks like and the mom is a queen, and Zara felt sick because none of these people understood that justice doesn't erase trauma. Consequences for perpetrators don't heal victims, and going viral doesn't make you feel better, it just makes you feel exposed. Her phone rang and it was her best friend Keisha from Chicago, voice tight with worry. "Z, I saw the videos. Are you okay? Why didn't you text me? I'm so sorry that happened to you." And Zara tried to explain but the words came out jumbled because how do you tell your best friend that you spent 20 minutes thinking you were going to miss the biggest opportunity of your life because a pilot's wife decided you didn't belong in first class? How do you articulate the specific humiliation of having 60 people watch you beg for basic dignity and choose to film instead of help? Meanwhile, in Chicago, the fallout was spreading in ways Richard and Catherine Reeves couldn't have anticipated, their homeowners association calling an emergency meeting to discuss whether having known racists in the community violated the neighborhood covenant, their church receiving calls from members threatening to leave if the Reeves family wasn't asked to step down from their volunteer positions, and their daughter texting to say her kids were being bullied at school because classmates had seen the videos and were calling them the racist pilot's grandchildren. Catherine sat in their living room that evening surrounded by wine bottles and tissues, scrolling through comments that called her every name imaginable, and part of her wanted to post an apology, but her lawyer had advised against it, saying anything she wrote could be used in the lawsuits that were inevitably coming. So instead she sat in silence with her ruined reputation and her terminated husband and the growing understanding that 20 minutes of letting her prejudice control her mouth had destroyed everything they'd spent 50 years building. Richard's pilot union called to inform him they wouldn't be representing him in any grievance procedures because discrimination cases created liability they wouldn't touch, and his lawyer explained that Vista Airways had documentation of previous complaints about his treatment of passengers of color, incidents that had been noted but not acted upon because airlines protect pilots until the moment protecting them becomes more expensive than firing them, and Richard realized with dawning horror that his career hadn't ended today, it had been ending for years. He'd just been too privileged to notice the warnings. The Vista Airways board of directors held an emergency meeting that evening, some members questioning whether Diane had overreacted by firing Richard on the spot without investigation, and Diane played them the audio recording from Zara's phone that captured everything Catherine said, every microaggression and dismissal, and that final command to move to the back where she belongs. And the boardroom went silent because there's no defending that, no corporate speak that makes telling a child she belongs in the back sound like anything other than what it was. One board member, an older white man named Gerald who'd been skeptical of Diane's diversity initiatives, cleared his throat and said perhaps we should consider that Mrs. Reeves didn't mean it the way it sounded, perhaps there's context we're missing, and Diane looked at him with eyes that had seen too much racism disguised as benefit of the doubt. Gerald, if you can listen to that recording and find context that makes it acceptable to tell my daughter she belongs in the back, then maybe you should reconsider whether you belong on this board, and 3 other board members nodded agreement while Gerald's face went red with embarrassment that felt a lot like accountability finally arriving. In Seattle, Zara stood at the hotel window watching ferries cross the Sound, their lights reflecting on dark water, and she thought about her grandmother who'd ridden in the back of buses not by choice but by law, who'd been denied service at lunch counters and education at white schools and dignity in 1,000 daily ways that racism enforces, and Zara understood with painful clarity that the fight her grandmother had fought was the same fight she was fighting now, just with different weapons. Segregation had evolved from laws to looks, from signs to assumptions, from explicit to implicit, but the message was always the same: you don't belong here. Her presentation materials sat on the desk, 2 years of research reduced to 40 slides and a 15-minute speech, and Zara wondered if she had the strength to stand on that stage tomorrow and talk about climate algorithms when her own climate felt like a storm she couldn't predict or control, if she could face an auditorium full of people who might recognize her from viral videos and see victim instead of scientist. Marcus knocked on the door with room service, comfort food he'd ordered without asking because sometimes grief needs French fries and chocolate cake more than healthy options, and he sat with Zara while she picked at her food and finally asked the question that had been haunting her since the plane landed. "Why didn't anyone help me?" Zara said, her voice small and young in ways that broke Marcus's heart. 60 people watched and filmed and nobody said stop, nobody told that woman to leave me alone, nobody stood up until after my mom already fixed it. Why does everyone find their courage after it's safe? Marcus had no good answer because there is no good answer. Just the uncomfortable truth that most people choose comfort over justice, choose silence over risk, choose to be bystanders instead of allies until someone with more power does the hard work first. And that truth is one of the most painful lessons anyone learns about human nature, and one that Zara had learned at 13 in the most public way possible. The National Youth Tech Summit opened the next morning with 300 young scientists gathered in a convention center ballroom that smelled like coffee and ambition. And Zara sat in the third row wearing a blazer her mother had packed and trying to focus on the opening keynote about artificial intelligence ethics while her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from CNN and the New York Times and the Today Show, who all wanted to talk about what happened on Flight 447, but none of them wanted to talk about her climate algorithm. Diane Mitchell arrived during the first break, walking into that ballroom in a power suit that made conference organizers straighten their spines. And she found her daughter standing alone near the pastry table, looking small and lost in ways that made Diane's heart crack open all over again, because she could give Zara first-class seats and private education and every material advantage, but she couldn't protect her from the racism that saw a black girl and decided she didn't belong. "Baby, how are you holding up?" Diane asked, pulling Zara into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected, and Zara's answer came out muffled against her mother's shoulder in words that hurt to hear. "Everyone here knows who I am, but not because of my research. They know me from the videos. I heard some kids whispering about the plane incident when I walked past, and I worked so hard to be here as a scientist, but now I'm just the girl who got a pilot fired, and I don't know if I can go on that stage and present like nothing happened." Diane pulled back and held her daughter's face in both hands, her CO mask dropping to show the mother underneath who would burn the world down to spare her child one moment of pain, but couldn't because life doesn't work that way. "Listen to me, Zara. What happened yesterday was terrible and traumatic and unfair, but you're here. You made it to this summit despite everything that pilot and his wife tried to take from you, and your algorithm that predicts climate change is more important than any viral video. So when you walk on that stage in 2 hours, you show everyone that you're not defined by other people's racism, you're defined by your brilliance." Zara's presentation slot came right after lunch, her name announced to polite applause that felt heavier than it should because half the room had probably watched her cry on video the night before, and she walked to the podium with her laptop and her notes and her grandmother's voice in her head saying, "They want you to be small, so be enormous instead." The first slide showed her climate algorithm's predictive model, complex equations that mapped temperature changes across decades, and Zara's voice shook when she started speaking but grew steadier with each sentence, each data point, each projection that proved her 2 years of research could actually help scientists understand weather patterns before they became disasters. 3 rows from the front, a girl about Zara's age raised her hand during the Q&A session, her voice carrying through the ballroom when she spoke. "I don't have a question about your algorithm. I just wanted to say that I saw what happened to you yesterday and I'm sorry. And your research is amazing and you're brave, and I hope you know that you belong here not because you survived discrimination but because you're brilliant." The room erupted into applause, standing ovation that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition, 300 young scientists acknowledging one of their own who'd faced the worst of humanity and still showed up to present her best work. And Zara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were different tears this time, not trauma but something closer to healing. A venture capital firm approached Diane after the presentation wanting to fund Zara's algorithm development, talking about commercialization and patents and turning her research into a startup that could actually impact climate policy, and Diane negotiated terms on her daughter's behalf while Zara stood nearby, realizing that the work she'd done in her bedroom for 2 years might actually change something bigger than herself. But that evening when they returned to the hotel, Zara collapsed on the bed and admitted what she'd been holding back all day. "Mom, I don't want to do interviews about what happened. I don't want to be the face of airline discrimination. I just want to be a scientist who happens to be black, not a black victim who happens to do science. Is that okay?" Diane sat beside her daughter and squeezed her hand, understanding completely because she'd spent 40 years navigating that same impossible balance between excellence and identity, between achievement and expectation. "Of course it's okay, baby. You don't owe anyone your trauma. You presented your research and that's enough. Let the adults handle the rest." And Zara fell asleep that night feeling lighter than she had since boarding Flight 447, even though she knew the healing would take years, not days. 3 months after Flight 447, Zara Mitchell sat in her therapist's office talking about nightmares where she was trapped in airplane seats while strangers filmed her crying, and Dr. Patel explained gently that trauma doesn't follow logic or timelines, that her body would need time to understand it was safe now even though her mind knew the immediate danger had passed. And some Tuesday afternoons, Zara still couldn't bring herself to look at photos of airplanes without her chest tightening with panic she couldn't quite name. Richard Reeves filed for bankruptcy 4 months after his termination when the legal fees and settlement costs from 3 separate discrimination lawsuits exceeded everything he'd saved in 19 years of flying, and he took a job as a dispatcher at a small regional airport in Montana, earning a third of his pilot salary. And every day he walked past aircraft he'd never command again, he thought about 20 minutes that cost him everything and still couldn't quite accept that consequences were proportional to actions, even when those actions traumatized a child. Catherine became a case study in online harassment courses about what happens when your worst moment goes viral, her face permanently associated with racism in a way that made employment impossible and friendships conditional, and she wrote an apology letter to Zara that her lawyer advised her not to send, an apology that started with "I'm sorry" but quickly devolved into explanations about stress and misunderstandings and everything except accountability, so the letter stayed in a drawer unsent. Because some apologies are more about the apologizer's comfort than the victim's healing. Vista Airways implemented the Mitchell Protocol, named after Zara, a policy requiring immediate investigation of any passenger complaint involving discrimination with third-party oversight and mandatory captain retraining quarterly. And within 6 months, discrimination complaints dropped 43%, which sounded like victory until you remembered it took a 13-year-old girl being terrorized to force that change. Zara turned 14 3 weeks after the Seattle summit and spent her birthday being interviewed by Time magazine for their most influential teens issue, and the article focused on her climate algorithm, but the headline read "Teen Scientist Stands Up to Airline Racism," which made Zara want to scream because she hadn't stood up to anything. She'd been sitting in her assigned seat trying not to cry while adults failed her, but that narrative didn't fit the inspiring story America wanted, so they rewrote her trauma into triumph she didn't quite feel. Her algorithm got acquired by a climate research consortium for an amount that would fund her college education and beyond, and Zara donated half to organizations fighting discrimination in aviation because if her suffering had to mean something, then maybe it could protect other kids from experiencing what she'd endured, though she knew money couldn't solve racism, only make its consequences slightly more manageable. 2 years later, Zara boarded her first flight since the incident, her mother beside her this time, and when the flight attendant said "Welcome aboard," Zara's whole body tensed, waiting for someone to question her presence, to demand she move, to tell her she didn't belong, and Diane squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered, "You're safe, I've got you, we're going to be okay." And Zara believed her even though the panic attack didn't fully subside until they landed 3 hours later. She wrote college application essays about resilience and discrimination and the cost of going viral, and admissions officers at MIT and Stanford and Caltech read her words and saw a young woman who'd survived something that would have broken most adults, who'd channeled trauma into research that might actually help save the planet, who understood that excellence wasn't armor against racism but was valuable anyway because giving up meant letting the Richard and Catherine Reeves of the world. The passenger from seat 2A who'd filmed everything and posted it with that LinkedIn essay about being shocked and appalled sent Zara a friend request 2 years later with a message saying he thought about her often and hoped she was doing well, and Zara deleted the request without responding because she didn't need friendship from people who found their voices only after her mother had already delivered justice. Didn't need connection from bystanders who performed allyship for professional clout while staying silent when silence was safer. Zara's grandmother died when she was 16, the woman who'd ridden segregated buses and marched for civil rights and told her granddaughter stories about dignity in the face of hatred. And at the funeral, Zara gave a eulogy about how Grandma Rose had prepared her for Flight 447 without knowing it, had taught her that racism evolves but resistance does too, that some fights are won and some are survived and both require courage that looks different depending on the day. She graduated high school early and enrolled at MIT to study climate science and artificial intelligence. And on her first day of college orientation, when the professor asked students to introduce themselves and share something interesting, Zara said, "I'm Zara Mitchell, I'm from Chicago, and I'm here to change how we predict climate disasters." And she didn't mention viral videos or airline incidents or the worst day of her life because she decided years ago that her story would be about what she built, not what got broken. If watching Zara's story made you realize you need to speak up when you witness discrimination and not just film it, Drop a comment pledging to be better because silence enables harm and she needed allies, not videographers. If this broke your heart and made you understand that viral justice doesn't heal trauma, hit that subscribe button to support stories that expose the real cost of racism. Smash that like button if you believe children deserve protection, not performance. Tell us in the comments whether you'll choose courage over comfort the next time you see injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that going viral doesn't make you whole, it just makes you visible. Thank you for watching Zara's journey from Flight 447 to MIT, from victim to survivor to scientist who refused to let 20 minutes of hatred define 20 years of brilliance. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and commit to being the person who speaks up, not the person who films and stays silent.